forward to hearing the discussion, and thanks to our speakers for their time. Over to you, Fatima.
Thank you, Karis, and good afternoon, everyone. What a pleasure it is to be here on another IPPR webinar, and this time with two people who I call friends and co-conspirators in the fight to really transform our societies and our economies in a way that's fit for life that is thriving. And today we'll be talking about their exciting new book, which is called, right here, as you can see, really well read and referenced, A Planet on Fire, a manifesto for the age of environmental breakdown. And the first time I met Laurie and Matthew, they were writing this book back in 2019. So I was particularly interested to see how the book and their ideas that they had 2 years ago transformed through this age, the age of the coronavirus, where we really stand at the precipice of, change, whether it's change that sort of reboots the economy of yesterday and tethers us further to extractivism and fossil fuels, or one that charts a new path, one that centers a caring economy, one that centers life and justice, really importantly. And this is a book that uses justice as a barometer for success. And you can see that throughout the book, that all of the ideas in here are rooted in a justice that asks the question, who has the power and to what end, and how do they use it? And so I'm very excited to talk to Matthew and Laurie about this book a bit more, and also just to talk about how we put this book to use. The way that I'm putting this book to use is it's going to be a reference book for my campaigning into the future. And I've noted in it all of the ideas and new learnings that I'm going to pump into the work that I do as the co-founder and co-director of Green New Deal UK, an organization whose focus is to build the movement for the sort of transformative change that this book details out. To get us started, I'm going to first hand over to Laurie, who's going to do a brief presentation, and then Matthew, and then we'll have a conversation. But in the meantime, think of questions and put them in the Q&A box. We will come to those questions in about 30 minutes. Tweet. The hashtag for today is IPPR webinar. And also don't forget, today, everybody who has signed up to attend this webinar will get 50% off this book. So use the link that came in the email for the Zoom link and purchase that book on Verso or other platforms. So over to you, Laurie.
Thanks, Fatima, and thanks, Karis, as well. And to all of you who are tuning in, it's fantastic to be here. And I just wish we could be doing it in person. I'm going to talk a bit about the problems. I'm often called Dr. Doom, which I think is grossly unfair because I don't have a PhD, but I will talk about those problems, and then Matt will come in and talk a lot about the solutions that we talk about in the book, which is what we really want to be the focus of anyone who's interacting with our messages. I'm going to talk about this in a way that hopefully is as relevant as possible to what we're seeing at the moment, particularly in the wake of this big climate summit that was organized by Joe Biden, the US president, the other day. And we're seeing there a number of countries signing up to these targets that are far more ambitious than what we saw before. And in the UK, we've had this new target of nearly an 80% reduction by 2025 for emissions by 2035. And this is obviously very welcome that these kind of ambitious targets are being signed up to. And I would say that we could crudely characterize the approach, the policy approach to meeting those targets, because they won't meet themselves, as something along the lines of, we're going to swap dirty technologies for clean alternatives, and we're going to try and set up the market mechanisms largely so that that happens at a much faster pace than we're currently seeing at the moment. And to stress, it is good that this progress is being made, but across the book, we largely deal with three challenges we think that status quo approach, however much it's modifying itself recently, particularly off the back of Trump losing and various changes we're seeing here in the UK and other countries, three challenges that it will face. The first is consumption. So at this point, it's really important to point out that the global environmental emergency isn't just about the climate. We're depleting soils, we're decimating animal populations, many species are becoming extinct, habitats are being pulled down, and so on. Now, if you're swapping your dirty for your clean, you've got to ask yourself the question, do we have enough environmental room, or enough of an environmental budget, so that's soils to deplete, animals to kill, habitats to destroy, and so on, such that we can swap all the dirty for the clean stuff, because that comes at an environmental cost, at least at the moment, that we already have. So all the dirty stuff swapped for clean that we already have. And then keep up with all the new stuff that we want to be creating and giving to people all around the world. And at least in the way that Western lifestyles often demand at the moment. And that is a huge question. And we're not sure if we have enough of that environmental budget to do everything that I just described there. And that doesn't also factor in that many of those lifestyles, a high material consumption lifestyle, leads to all sorts of problems, health problems, problems with inequality that we probably wouldn't want anyway. So the first big challenge is consumption. The second is power. So the approach of leading politicians and policymakers, we could say over the last many decades, is basically to ignore or marginalize the importance of power, particularly from institutions in the finance sector and elsewhere. Industry standards are often voluntary, boards are geared towards the short-term returns of maximizing profit for companies, and often also fall with interests that people who've got interest in environmental destruction. And we've seen recently, for example, that 77% of directors on boards of 7 US banks have ties with climate conflicted groups. And that means that since the Paris Agreement, we've had something along the lines of $4 trillion worth of investment in fossil fuels being made by banks since that point, since countries said we've got to be phasing out emissions. And so we've got to make sure that even if we were tackling things like a consumption problem and we were swapping dirty for clean quick enough, we've got to have the measures to make sure that we tackle vested power that's stopping the kind of changes that we need. And I think the third challenge is then fairness. The environmental emergency is fundamentally grossly unfair. In general, countries and also communities who contributed the most to environmental destruction and have benefited enormously in terms of economic and social development are more capable of insulating themselves and their populations and their interests from the growing impacts. And in complete contrast, those who contributed least are the ones who are often most exposed and don't necessarily have the resources at their disposal to be protecting themselves to the inevitable impacts. And it's not just a moral imperative to be dealing with that unfairness, it is also a practical imperative as well. To put it crudely, a high inequality, low cooperation world leaves us with little options. And in the book, we echo some of the concerns that are growing now, that in a world in which environmental impacts are mounting, and we are not dealing with the unfairness at the heart of this, we get the rise of an explicit sort of eco-nativism that exploits people's fear and distrust of each other and gets the focus away from equitably sorting out the problem and instead focuses on protecting what's left and the interests of smaller groups of people. And those three challenges, consumption, power, and fairness, intersect with each other. So for example, you could find yourself in a situation where in the UK, we had a much more equitable balance of power and we were starting to change our lifestyles here to reduce environmental impacts, but we ignored global fairness. And it created this problem of a sort of green colonialism in which our changes, even equitable within the country, are coming at the cost of countries abroad, where we're ripping out precious metals to make our electric vehicles and things like this. Or you could have a situation where you have a very fair transition in this country and others around the world that workers are involved with, communities are not disenfranchised, and power is much more equally distributed. But it only deals with the climate issue. And we're still in serious trouble because we've got a model of lifestyle that is still depleting soils and ripping through ecosystems. And what that fundamentally means is we need a deeper, more structural level of change that we're encouraging as we go forward, and one that grapples with those three challenges. So on that note, I'll hand over to Matt, who can go through some of the kind of things we talk about when it comes to solutions and what that systemic change looks like.
Great, thanks, Laurie, and hello everyone. And it's a pleasure to be with you all and be back, at least digitally, at IPPR. I'm Matthew, co-author of the book with Laurie. So I think the first thing I'd say is that the good news is, and yet this is a deep challenge, is that this is a multifaceted crisis, a crisis of economics, a crisis of justice, a crisis of society, of racial injustice, etc. But above all, it is a political crisis. So we have the technical means, we have the resources, we increasingly have the know-how, the sort of knowledge about how we would not just decarbonize our economy, but do so to bring it within sustainable limits in the round and do so equitably. So we actually know how to do it, but increasingly it's a crisis of power, of who has voice, of who controls institutions, of whose interests are centered in decision-making and in how we organize both today's society, but also the future. So if it's a political crisis, it necessarily needs a political response of all society-wide efforts to reimagine our futures for a world of post-carbon plenty. And in that sort of vision, we sort of sketch, I guess, two underpinning thrusts to the argument around sort of, what is a political crisis and how do we respond? And the first is to insist that many of the institutions that are taken as natural, taken as things that are beyond politics, beyond the ability of society to reimagine, are in fact exactly that. They're made by politics, they're made by law, they're made by social institutions. So whether that's legal systems, markets, financial institutions, incentive structures, all of these have been made, and therefore we have the power to remake them and to insist that they're not natural, but actually subject to the capability of democracies to reorder them. And the second thing alongside denaturalizing is, of course, the need to re-embed our economies within nature and within sort of social relationships. So we know that our economies are deeply reliant on sort of growth for the extraction of wealth from nature and the extraction of wealth from unwaged labor, social relationships, social reproduction. And so there's that dual thrust. We need to denaturalize things that we sort of assume are just sort of, like descend from the heavens and that's just how they are, while also re-embedding sort of ourselves in nature and just social relationships. And as Laurie says, this is a systemic crisis and therefore it requires a systemic response. And it's interesting to see if you look at someone like Janet Yellen, the new sort of Treasury of the Secretary in the US, talking explicitly in these sort of big systemic crises we're facing. So there's a growing recognition there's a systemic crisis, and that requires systematically rethinking some of our foundational institutions, how our financial systems organized, how our sort of central banks operate, etc. And in the book, we sort of set out 5 overlapping areas, and the key thing in many ways is these are all intertwined. You can't sort of deal with one sort of in isolation from the other. But we set out 5 overlapping areas which begin to gesture towards the type of future we can win together. So the first is looking at sort of a new sort of international order. So one founded on principles of solidarity, of reparative care, of mutual interest rather than sort of antagonistic and very hierarchical global systems. So there's bits on the global trading system around sort of institutions like the World Bank and the IMF about what does sort of just multilateralism look like, which, as Laurie says, like there's going to be so much stress on sort of our societies in the coming decades that cooperation is going to be absolutely critical. So what are the institutions at a local, at a national, and at an international level we can organize that? We then look at finance, and we argue that really we have the resources to afford the transition. In fact, we don't have the resources not to afford it because the costs are far greater if we fail. But it's about reorganizing who has voice, who controls investment, the priorities, the principles that underpin it. And we set out a range of sort of deep institutional reforms of central banking, of private finance, and of course, the role of a sort of transformative green sort of investment surge as we emerge from COVID to sort of reorder our future. The third is work. So our argument really is in some ways that, contrary to sort of some of the sort of breathless claims you get about robots about to take all our jobs, automation's about to destroy all sort of, employment relationships, the challenge is actually the reverse. It's to make work just and good. So that's about, rebalancing power at work. That's about rebalancing power in wider society. And it's about making purposeful work, decent work. But it's also about expanding our ability to live thriving lives outside of work as well. So we talk about sort of a high leisure, low carbon impact society, more spaces for communal luxury, more spaces for play, for creativity. And then we talk about the commons. So we open with a chapter looking at how Bolsonaro in Brazil, who in many ways embodies some of the sort of themes that Laura's talking about, is about this sort of blending together of a sort of eco-fascist meets far right, fossil capital political coalition, has been absolutely devastating the Amazon. And that's in some ways a key part of the global commons. But we look at a whole series of commoning. So this idea of shared resources that are stewarded democratically together for the common good rather than being enclosed and extracted and exploited for very narrow short-term interests. So whether that's about new technologies, and we have a bit on sort of IP, which obviously, with the sort of appalling vaccine apartheid going on right now, was very relevant. But bits around land, around our food systems, about how we organise our towns and cities, and then finally we look at sort of the strategy for how we'd win this type of world, because I think the challenge now, in some ways, which goes back to this point about a political crisis, is that there's growing recognition, and we see this with the targets, which are encouraging, but there's growing recognition of this need for systemic change, the need for pace and scale hitherto unimaginable in how we transform our societies together. But there's increasingly a gap between the sort of the rhetoric and the ambition and the actual institutions, the plans, the policies, but also the sort of the pressure to do that. And I think, certainly the book was in many ways inspired by, the Green New Deal movement and the sort of school strikers and the whole uprising we've seen in the last few years of movements for environmental and racial and sort of social justice. And in some ways, we sort of end with sort of sketching of how we could get there, and a sense like to win this world of sort of post-carbon communal luxury and sort of better living for all, thriving life, as was mentioned earlier. It's about sort of a whole society effort. So it's about social movements. It's about organising in workplaces. It's about building power if you're a renter or in sort of housing associations. It's about sort of really embedding people into sort of political processes. It can't be one thing or the other. We've got to pull all the levers all at once. But the prize, we argue, is a world of thriving, flourishing life. And if we fail, it's a world of accelerating environmental breakdown that Dr. Doom or otherwise, whether you've got a doctor or not, Laurie, really that is the choice now between a world of thriving life and a world of escalating and unnecessary escalating social pain.
Wow, thank you both of you. And I think everybody who is watching will appreciate, I think, just from your presentations, how broad and comprehensive this book is. And I really want to start at the beginning. I think the thing that struck me was just how honest an account this is of the challenges that we face, but also it's a marked different to how history of the climate crisis or environmental breakdown is told to date. We mostly focus on the past 50 years. Here, you really tell a much broader story that starts 500 years ago. And how important is it in order for us to find solutions, for us to understand accurately what the problem is and how we got here? And you talk about environmental breakdown, not climate breakdown. Laurie, can you tell us why it's important for us to understand, what environmental breakdown is and how that is linked to both societal breakdown and just an age of chaos that we're really living through and will continue to live through unless we change?
Yeah, so we chose environmental breakdown as opposed to, say, climate change because of the importance of the two words. To put it crudely, let's say we could click our fingers now and emissions would be reduced to nothing tomorrow. We would still be in a globally very serious situation because of what's happened to biodiversity. So that's the extinction of species as well as the loss of animal populations. And across some populations, we've had an average loss of over 2/3 since the 1970s. And this goes on and on into other environmental areas. The nitrogen cycle is another one that's been impacted more possibly in the last, say, 150 years than it has been in its around 2.5 billion year history. So the point we wanted to make there is that it is absolutely critical that the mainstream frame does not see all the other stuff that's happening to the natural world as either non-existent or its own discrete set of things. They're intimately related to each other. And let's say, if you're not trying to ensure that we stop depleting soils, they play a massive role in drawing down carbon and making sure that we're tackling the climate change problem. So you just can't see any of these elements as inseparable. And that also then has a massive bearing on the solutions that you need to be looking at. Because if you could be rolling out things that do a very good job with emissions, but could have devastating impacts on biodiversity, we'd be in the massive trouble that we're in. And the connection to human systems, and this is a very important point, that we can't see this as we often do as a kind of the preserve of individual actions. It's just because we've all chosen to drive a car, or it's just because we got addicted to certain technologies when it came to those cars as well. We have to understand how our behavior as individuals, however much it is important to bear in mind, is itself deeply impacted and determined in many ways by the behavior of those systems. It wasn't a generation 50, 60, 70 years ago of consumers who put their hand up and said, we need to have a global aviation industry. And then choice and consumer desire meant that happened and had the devastating impacts that it's had on the climate. It was a much more complicated process. And we think that we're just not talking about the need to change those systems enough in the context of what the mainstream discussion is. And often, and now I'll finish after this, often you get this pushback of, well, we don't have time to overthrow capitalism. And firstly, what does that mean? What do you mean overthrow capitalism? Does that mean you want to get rid of the price mechanism and abolish all private property? Well, we're not talking about that. We've got to evolve the dominant economic system that we have. And that has happened at many times in human history. And we're going to keep lamenting the fact that the emissions graph is not going down or another species has become extinct until we really get our head round how this is driven by our systems, and that those systems, how they operate, how they evolve, has a lot more to do with our choices, our policies, than we're allowing ourselves to conceive of right now.
I'll come back to that last point. I mean, the story that really comes to mind for me is the Easter Island story, which for me, a big part of how we change is changing the stories about human history. And not just changing, I think what was interesting that you noted in here is the story just wasn't true about Easter Island. It's not that we're changing it, it's that we took the wrong lessons from it. And I think that's been protracted throughout history, where our Occam razor approach to explaining why humans act the way they do has just simply been wrong.
Yeah, and just for those who aren't aware of this, the sort of classical story of what happened in Easter Island is that it's out there in the middle of the Pacific. It's separated from anyone else, and the civilization that was on there over the course of the 1500s and after overused the natural environment, and they therefore undermined their ability to grow food, and that society turned on each other, and the whole thing led to the collapse of that society. And when Westerners rocked up, they found this place that was a shadow of presumably a time when you had a very vibrant civilization that built the head and torso statues, the moai that we associate, at least in countries like the UK, with the island. And that's been emblematic of, in many environmental conversations, what's going on right now. The Easter Island is a mini version of the world, and that through our own short-termism and use of certain technologies, we're just leading ourselves to that sort of ecocide, environmental suicide. But the story's not true. And what actually happened, which we better understand now, is that the civilization actually reached a situation where it had a bit of a steady state with the local environment, had cultural norms, for example, that stopped over exploitation of certain things. And actually what happened was contact with a certain type of Westerner who was coming over led to certain diseases going on the island, people being taken to be sold into the slave trade, islanders were shot as boats went past for target practice and that kind of stuff. And it was that drove the collapse of the civilization on Easter Island. And the people who went over to Easter Island weren't just doing it for a laugh. They were doing it because they were compelled there by increasingly globalized economic systems. And that more true story is a better, more useful analogy to have in your head, story to have in your head when you're trying to understand how we got to this point. And then the story about these two stories is itself, I think, a really useful way to understand the huge blank spots that we have in our mainstream narrative of how we're in this situation.
Absolutely. Matt, the thing that scared me, I guess, in reading that chapter, and then we'll move on to the fun stuff, is how this is linked to the politics of environmental breakdown. And one of the things that you both say is that, environmental breakdown is unlikely to create the conditions that favor the type of leadership and hope and working together that we need to transform. And so you write about the threats of ethno-nationalism. Right now, in this present moment with COVID, there's an opportunity for change. What do you feel like are the positive things that have changed over the last year that make this the moment to pick up some of the ideas in this book? And what are some of the new threats in this moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the sort of key overarching things which relates to the COVID thing is that, yes, the status quo without change leads to worlds of increasing distress and stress on sort of political and social institutions and systems, and that leads to less cooperation. But exactly the type of things that leads to better work, healthier communities, stronger neighborhoods, lower energy bills, things that just like ordinary lives will be improved are what is required in the transition. And we can begin to do a lot of these things now, today. And so I think the COVID opportunity, I think in some ways it's been this weird, strange half world where our economy has suddenly been organized around public health imperatives rather than sort of profit maximization. It's things like aviation and sort of car-based transport has been sort of stalled dramatically. There's been sort of some forms of international cooperation that have been really heightened, others less so. So it's kind of been this sort of strange, like half mirror like style view of a world in which we can begin to make change. And I think the key thing in some ways is, and I think the Biden administration is beginning to show that to a degree, but the key thing in some ways is as we try and exit COVID, and frankly, I don't think it will be a sort of binary, okay, we've had COVID and we haven't, as we can see from the global situation, infection rates are as high as they've ever been. But we can try and use that momentum and say, we really must build back better. We must use this moment, this unique moment, to have a sort of investment surge, public and private investment that is channeled towards the things we need to do, whether it's our energy systems, our food systems, our land systems, our transport systems, and really try and not just sort of reflate the old, but build the new, and sort of in doing so embed principles of justice, of solidarity, and all the other things we want into the everyday operation of the world. So I think there's a huge opportunity there, because I think there's a sort of sense from lots of people that we don't want to just go back to the old ways, a sense that in the inequalities and insecurities that many people face, whether it's at work, in our social care system, there's a whole host of areas where the stresses of COVID, which after all in some ways is exactly a sort of a symptom of environmental breakdown, its causes are rooted in a whole set of entanglements between nature and sort of economic systems. But exactly that sort of vulnerability that COVID exposed provides a stimulus to sort of respond. But at the same time, you can also see, and this is why, again, it goes back to politics, goes back to sort of social power, goes back to sort of movements. You can also see in COVID and some of the responses to it, exactly the type of world that can lead to sort of vast immiseration on a global scale. So whether that's sort of the hardening of borders, the sort of restriction on mobility, whether it's the sort of inequality shock, the profound inequality shock that COVID has generated, whether that's sort of the failure of global cooperation, as we're seeing with sort of IP around the vaccines and the TRIPS waiver. So as ever, there's no there's a good and there's a bad. There's always sort of contestable futures, and it's about sort of all of us together, whether we're in business, trade unions, social movements, all these things together, trying to sort of pull us towards the better future that is very much possible and winnable. But we've really got to sort of almost make use of the crisis, so to speak, to sort of slingshot our way out of this on a much better trajectory than that which we entered into.
Do you think it'd be fair to say that a lot of those conversations about opportunities for doing things differently have been in a national context? Just reflecting on my past year, it's very much been about my house, my community. Like, really the most I've thought about is what's happening in the UK in terms of the work that we're doing day to day. And it could be said that the way that we've responded to COVID, at least in the narrative that exists, has been very nation state focused, and is happening at the backdrop of, further militarized borders and people, losing their lives in the Mediterranean and the Channel. It's happened in the backdrop of a government that has cut, overseas development aid. How do we push back against those type of responses to a climate crisis, where we sort of pull up our borders and build solidarity between movements too? Because what I loved about this book is it talks about building power right from the local, but not just the local for local sake, but a local that transforms a global. So what are some tangible ways that you think that we could be pushing back against this sort of nationalism that might underlie a response to environmental breakdown?
It's a really important question. I think in some ways, it's almost like concentric, expanding and interconnected sort of waves of solidarity, of new forms of creativity, of new forms of organizing. So whether that's the very local, which in some ways COVID, as you say, has really made sense, but then recognizing that those sort of local efforts to build low traffic neighborhoods or green community energy companies, with distributed generation systems in your local area, whatever it might be, those are then interconnected with questions of global justice and the sort of implications of climate breakdown and environmental breakdown that are going to sort of hit people around the world. And there's no way that, there's no way you can put up a border and sort of shelter yourself, even if you wanted to, disregarding the sort of huge inequalities and sort of injustices that would sort of exacerbate. So I think it's exactly about trying to, connect efforts to protect the Amazon. We're going to be seeing an election in Brazil between Lula and Bolsonaro very soon. Efforts to connect that, working with social movements there, working with trade unions there, working with sort of people who financial institutions are looking to steward the Amazon, not sort of turn it into sort of hyper sort of extracted zone. And then sort of working with institutions that already exist, whether it's the UN, whether it's sort of the UK's relationship with the EU, and of course at the end of this year there'll be an interesting test of this, which is the UN COP, the sort of climate conference at Glasgow, and that's a real opportunity to say, like, well, actually, yes, there might be differences between various different states and local, there might be differences between the interests of London versus sort of Birmingham. I think they're overblown, but in some ways where there is unity is actually, if we don't address this problem together, then we'll all suffer it alone. And of course, the double injustice that Laurie mentions, of course, those who will suffer most, and tens of millions already are, if not hundreds of million, are those who are least responsible. But there's no escaping this problem. So exactly because it's a shared problem, and because there's sort of uneven responsibility but uneven capability, there's that opportunity. And I think that key thing is, like, in some ways, this shouldn't be like sort of a hair shirt exercise, an opportunity to build a much better, more thriving world. And so in some ways, it's not just about like feeling solidarity, although we should obviously seek to build that. It's about sort of offering a really positive, hopeful sense of how, as societies, not just in the UK, but societies globally, we can sort of rebuild a world post-COVID and put ourselves on a new trajectory.
So one of the tensions that I feel as a campaigner, I often say that there's two sides to me. There's the radical in me, and then there's the person who's thinking about pragmatically, what can we do now? And trying to balance the pragmatic with the radical. And I could see that tension in your writing, where you're trying to balance the reformist with the transformational. And really, with the time that we have, we're talking about a decade to really make some of the biggest changes. Is that a right summary, that we need to be able to be reforming and engaging in some of the stuff around, how do we work with the system as it is? How do we build broad coalitions? How do we reform through regulation while also building the reality of a new economy? And you talk quite nicely about, and I'd love if you could elaborate about the parts of our economy that aren't capitalist, that they do exist. There are places where forms of working together and cooperatives and common ownership are already are operating in a hostile environment. What are those things that we could look towards and start creating a better environment for? And I don't know who wants to go first, but I'll let you guys jump in.
I might jump in briefly, and then Laurie sort of will take in. But I think you can sort of work on twin parallel tracks that reinforce each other. So you can work on the reformist, and you work on, like, here's a sort of technical tweak that in the insurance markets that will actually begin to sort of de-risk green projects, but really penalize fossil fuel projects. So you could have a campaign targeting Lloyd's of London. So you can make like reformist endeavors, but then also in doing those reforms, you prepare the ground for much deeper transformation. It's just like the NHS didn't just spring out of nowhere. It was actually like in some ways it was built through in the 1930s in Wales. There was sort of, community and cooperative forms of healthcare systems, and that was built on and transformed. So like, it's very rare that you get sort of complete binary ruptures in politics or in life where you just go from one position to another, reformist to transformation. So it's about doing both those together, having a sort of healthy sort of dynamic between the two. And I think, as you say, in that sense, like, we sort of in some ways draw on the work of people like Eric Odenreich, who points to the fact that actually you can scale many existing forms, whether they're sort of, cooperatives that are sort of providing green services, whether they're sort of community businesses that are sort of, doing sort of low carbon work, whether it's sort of, natural commonses that exist. There are a whole set of institutions and practices and ways of living and sort of working that do already embody many of the principles and the sort of environmental impacts that we need to scale. And so it's a question of not just inventing everything from scratch, but really putting the accelerator on the best that already exists, working hard to really put a brake on those practices that are unsustainable, and then using those moments of reform, but also sort of transformation through sort of strategic alignment to try and make a breakthrough, whether it's in finance, whether it's in greening industry, whether it's in sort of public healthcare systems. So that'd be my sense of it.
Laurie, I guess the challenge that we face is justice and speed. That is the negotiation I think we all face, is doing this quick enough so that we can survive, but doing it in a way that deals with injustice and make sure that most people everywhere are able to live better lives as a result of this transformation. How do we make that negotiation, and what side of it do we fall?
I think we first have to appreciate what I mentioned earlier, which is that that's not just a moral thing. It's a deeply practical imperative, in the same way that it's not just a moral imperative to ensure that countries all over the world, and particularly in the global south, have got access to vaccines. It's also a practical imperative, because we will just not be able to control the coronavirus pandemic if we are leaving people behind, because it will run riot in those countries and we'll see mutations. And in that regard, we are as strong as our weakest member. And you can translate that into a situation with the environmental crisis. As the destabilizing impacts grow, if you are obviously leaving certain communities behind, and you're obviously leaving certain countries behind, that is not going to happen in complete isolation. You could imagine a nightmarish world in which powerful communities and countries are able to sort of crush the discontent of those who are being particularly badly hit by the environmental crisis. But as things get worse, we will have a massively and a very unequal, uncooperative world. And that we're just not going to be able to deliver the kind of global changes that even leaders now are signing up to without that kind of cooperation. And we have to understand that in many ways that comes from, or has a direct translation from, the large and the global and the abstract that I'm talking about there down to the local level. And we're already having amazing work done in this country and around the world, in which local people are simultaneously able to understand better the kind of changes that they need, not just to ensure that their societies become more sustainable, but also crucially, they can simultaneously deal with the other problems that they face, like poor quality, precarious jobs, bad quality housing, lack of access to opportunities because of transport systems and otherwise. And then they're better able to identify the things that they can do to work together. And it provides a stake. Everyone is able to have a stake in what that transition looks like. So in the book, we one of the main chapters at the beginning of the solutions, and we put it there at the beginning on purpose, looked specifically at cooperation at very much the local level, at the scale of the national, and then at the scale of the international, and looked at how that has been eroded in many respects by the economic development model that we've seen around the world at those scales over the last 40 years or maybe longer, and some of the things that are being done to get around how that cooperation has been eroded. So we look at community wealth building, a local, more municipal model of development for local areas. We look at the instance of how the NHS is decarbonising itself at the national level as a sort of coordinator element of the state. And then at the international level, we look at how introducing more justice frames and explicit recognition of fairness into the targets and emissions that are being signed up to the moment would help in a massive way to resolve some of those tensions around cooperation that we're seeing.
Thanks, Laurie. Just a reminder for everyone to use the hashtag IPPR webinar to tweet about our conversation, and Olivia has kindly put in the chat our handles so that you can tag us, and a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll be coming to them shortly. And this is a personal question, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about this the last year, which is capitalism has a way of using crisis to renew itself. And we've seen with the Green New Deal and with the green economy rhetoric, how it has taken it over and rebranded itself only to further expand its same modes of extraction and organizing. And so I guess the question is, like, how do we push back against that? And what would be your, advice to the Green New Deal movement, which could crudely be summarized, some of their activities as purely focusing on changing the purpose of government investment and just getting the government to invest their way out of the crisis. And that's only one part of the plan that you put forward. There is other elements to it. How do we better as Green New Dealers incorporate the systemic view of the change that needs to happen into our work so that we can avoid feeding capitalism as it is and giving an opportunity to renew itself with our rhetoric and crush this counter-hegemonic movement?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I think that's the sort of constant tension of movements and campaigns of sort of putting pressure without being incorporated, and that dynamic. I think you guys do very well. But I mean, one area might be in the systemic. One area we look at in the book is the role of sort of law and sort of legal systems as a way of in where you think about contract law, property law, corporate law. These all structure behaviors of economic and social actors. They sort of either constrain, limit, or amplify the ability of some to act, to control, to corral, to use, to sort of direct. And if you look at the work of someone like Katerina Pistor, whose recent book, The Code of Capital, sort of helped feed into the bits on sort of reimagining the law. We looked at the law as sort of like a social coding system. So in some ways, you could sort of begin to do a very different form of capitalism, or however you want to sort of begin to call it, but a very different way of organizing the economy by sort of thinking about corporate governance and embedding principles of genuine sort of not net zero, but genuine sort of net zero, not like Shell's recent plan, which was envisaging using oil, coal, and gas in 2100, which seems sort of an interesting approach. But embedding genuine principles of sustainability into company law. So and then it's almost a distributed thing. So it's not just relying on sort of the Treasury or wherever always end coming up with like ever greater dollars of money. It's about changing how systems function. It might be about sort of saying, okay, rather than the Treasury sort of saying, let's have ever more subsidies for, and this actually speaks to a question by Peter Lippman in the questions, but rather than the Treasury saying, well, ever more subsidies for electric vehicle production, and sort of simply just go from which is Laurie's point is going from the world as it exists today, but a decarbonised world that's exactly the same. Why don't we say, right, Greater Manchester, Greater London, West Midlands Authority, here's powers and here's resources to build public and communal transport systems that centre low carbon modes of travel. So whether that's electric bus networks, 15-minute cities and neighbourhoods where you can walk to work, where you can sort of cycle to sort of your friends and sort of communities, the sort of low carbon infrastructure is built out. And you send sort of forms of work, forms of activity through the built environment, through the rules we create, through the sort of how we devolve powers to local economic actors, local communities. And so it doesn't always have to be about here's a very big demand that will only be able to take place as and when the state, and to speak to Chris Silver's point, we definitely think you need to democratize the state and contest it. We think it's a vital actor. But what we're saying is that you can do a whole set of systemic things that actually open up a sort of pluralistic range of activities. So, from the local to the law to sort of transport systems that don't just rely on just one focal point of campaigning, which is just like, can we get Rishi Sunak to stand up and say he's putting lots of money into low energy generation or whatever it might be. So I think there's multiple routes to try and approach the problem.
Fabulous. I'm going to ask one last question to each of you, and then we're going to get to the questions from people watching. Laurie, this is, I'm getting you to do a bit of my work, which is figure out what should be our demand in this year that the government is hosting the G7 and it's hosting COP26. What should be the demand coming from people who want to see systemic transformation, Green New Dealers globally, to unlock global transformation? What should be our demand? I think we've got a clear idea of what we need nationally from our governments, and our demand is around an investment-led investment as our response to recovery, and really focusing on delivering green jobs nationally. What should be our global ask? What would be the thing that could unlock something at a global level for us to rethink how we work together around systemic transformation? And to you, Matt, and again, if this is the wrong summary, please correct me. In reading this book, I felt like the answer really to the issues that we're facing is common ownership and democratization at every level. And one of the issues that I have noticed in my work is I think about democracy as electoralism, that it's changing who we vote for, getting new people in power. And that's not what you're talking about. So when you're talking about democratization, what is it that you want people to, what vision of it do you want people to walk away with in the way that we view people power and the way that we can use it to support change? So maybe let's get started with you, Laurie, and then Matthew can finish up for us.
I think that it's got to be around global equity and fairness in the context of emissions reductions. Again, I really must stress on this fear. It's so easy to sometimes not appreciate how divisive the perceptions of unfairness and the lived reality of unfairness is globally when you're in a country like the UK. But we can't be in this situation where emissions reductions are not demonstrably tied to the ability for certain countries to do this faster now, but also in relation to the amount of emissions they put into the atmosphere in the past. So I would say ideally you would have a fair share target where countries will be reducing their emissions even faster than they're currently signed up to, that makes reference to the fact that, for example, the UK is the 5th largest cumulative contributor to the climate problem. The atmosphere is a bit like a bathtub. It's how much we put in and not just the flow through the taps that's the problem. And that within that, far more money is given to nations around the world. So it's not just meeting the, at the moment, unmet goal of providing finance to countries in the global south, it's exceeding it and then ensuring that the rules around how that money is used are different, not loans, it's grants. And it's also making sure that local actors, investment bodies, public or private or whatever, are themselves able to decide where that money is then invested. And much of that money is also there to deal with this vexatious issue of loss and damage, of inevitable growing impacts that really press even further on the kind of wounds of unfairness that sit at the heart of this. So it's around that, I think, the big asks have got to be, and many people are cohering around those.
Yeah, I mean, just to add an extra ask to be cheeky, but I mean, I think the other thing would be like, definitely what Laurie said, but also like get really specific. So like, let's take the steel sector. So Commonwealth, the institution that I direct in my day job, so to speak, we put out a paper on the steel industry recently. Steel accounts for roughly a tenth of all global emissions. Now, roughly 75% of steel production is covered by net zero targets, but these are often quite distant. Let's take the example of producing this vaccine in record time and say, well, actually, it might not be sexy, but actually, we're not going to get to sort of the levels of reduction that Laurie's talking about that we need to do at a global level, let alone the UK, unless we can decarbonize really difficult things like cement or steel, or come up with alternative ways of producing, the things we're doing. So let's get really specific and make these like big national or international missions to do those things. And then that gets to the sort of second point. I think the sort of deep democratization of society, not just in sort of the political sphere, but in our workplaces, in our communities, in how our money is directed, and who controls financial institutions, is fundamental to it. But I suppose that speaks to a sort of wider sense is that we really do think that while this is an extraordinary challenge, and in some ways, as a sort of species, we've never really undertaken such sort of deep transformation in such a short amount of time. Well, that's what we have to do essentially. Nonetheless, we really do stress that yes, deep democratization has to be fundamental to that and is a sort of precondition in a way. But actually, the main point is that we really do have the resources, the creativity, the courage, the sort of commitment from tens of millions of people to do this, and we really can do this. And in doing so, we can build a sort of a healthier, a stronger, a more prosperous world. So it really is a win-win if we can get the politics right, if we can get the sort of power sort of dynamics right. And so I think that does lead, I think, to a world of greater democracy, greater sort of equity. But I think it's open to play for, and sort of that's the sort of struggle ahead of us, I guess.
Thank you. Alrighty, so we have a bunch of questions, and I'm just gonna get us started with the first one, which is from Chris Silver. He goes, I'd be keen to find out more about how the authors view the role of the state in this process, specifically when its institutions have evolved in a manner that have led towards ever more total capture by ecologically destructive systems. Can it offer the tools that we need?
So I think that one of the concepts that we like to talk about in the book is as the state as a sort of strategic, like an enabling coordinator of things. And in some ways, one interpretation of the last many decades is that we have reduced our ability to exercise the state and to use it as this supremely powerful player in society. And we've done that by reducing the amount of money it can spend in investments, by not recognizing the unique role it can play as a coordinator. And we kind of need to remember that. But that's not a return to the big centralized state of 30 or 40 years ago. It is ensuring that the sort of pyramid that we built in that cooperation chapter I mentioned is one in which that state is operating to provide sort of direction to what then become more localized units across, say, the UK, right? And it's those where a lot of the action is then taken. So think of your local state, the public sector in a sort of local area, as being the coordinator of certain activities on a scale that makes much more sense. And in many ways, this is already being thought about and being well developed. And I came to this through what are called the social determinants of health, the causes of ill health. And there have been for many years meetings in which you've got the police chief, the head of the fire service, you've got the local sort of economic growth champion, you've got the chief executives of the local authority, And the issue of, say, mental health is something that cuts across all of their perspectives, because the police chief knows that mental health is a key determinant of the crime that they see. And so does the fire service see how it's played into problems that happen in homes with fires. And the growth champion sees it as something that knocks on employment and that kind of stuff. And through the levers that they can exercise, like replanning how the city works or how the transport network is operating and qualities for housing and the planning requirements there, you've got a much more sort of tangible scale for how to deliver things. And for us, the state is then something that's able to provide the huge ballast and also direction behind that. And to go to the coronavirus pandemic as an example alongside, it was the huge resource capability of the state to invest in, say, the furlough scheme that sort of really showed us what the power of that thing is, and its ability to then coordinate across agencies. But one of the problems with the coronavirus pandemic with the state is it didn't appreciate the role of local authorities in running the public health response at the local level and the knowledge that local operatives had to do track and trace and things like that. So one of the things we talk about is how we've just not got to rediscover the power of the state, but then have it much more interacting with the local area, and through so also being more democratized.
Okay. Another question from Simon Maxwell, who's a friend of IPPR. We have 10 years to crack emissions, but reshaping power, overthrowing capitalism, and making society worldwide change is not going to happen in that time frame. What short-term actions can we take on Monday morning? So tomorrow.
So can I?
You were told. Huh?
Yeah, you go. No, go on. Finish.
Now, so the way that I'm going to interpret this is, if we put you guys in charge on Monday, what are some of the actions that we should be taking as a country and globally as of next week? And
well, can I just, Matt, I'm going to jump in quickly on this because I've sort of been brooding on this question, having seen it pop up earlier. And thanks, Simon, a lot for posting it. I look at it and it makes me really sad, because it shows that we've not done a good job in communicating what our main point is here, really. We're not talking about overthrowing capitalism. And I said earlier, I'm not sure what that actually means in practice. Does it mean abolishing the price mechanism or getting rid of private property? Well, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how we evolve our economic system. And I think often we're sometimes in environmental discussions, because of the high stakes, we're stuck in this kind of tyranny of the binary of we carry on with the exact strategy that we see in the world right now, or slight modifications, or we must be suggesting that we're having the overthrow of capitalism or a massive change in something. And that's not what we're talking about here. The kind of solutions in a book, and I would urge you all to have a look at them, are about the next evolution of our economic system, which has happened time and time again. And in the UK, we had particular points of evolution after the Second World War and then after the crises in the 1970s. Power is already being reshaped. It would have been unimaginable to think of the changes that we're seeing with, say, the rollout of the diesel and petrol engine even a few years ago, we would have thought, my goodness, the power of motorists or the motor lobby is too great for us to just cycle out these kind of technologies. But power remains a non-trivial barrier. When you find out that Exxon knew about this stuff for a very long time and developed sophisticated strategies to manipulate the science and delay action, that is fundamentally a problem of power. And I think for too long, we have not attacked that directly and tried to do something about it. And the emissions have still gone up. And I don't think that those things are unrelated to each other. And then finally, when it comes to remaking society worldwide, again, we're not talking about how, that's such a big thing. We're talking about substantive things underneath, but we need more imagination. That we've had big changes to our societies, whether at the international level in many ways or at local levels before, and they've been pushed by crises. Those imagination has been demand, and it has been answered. And we've had changes that occurred, like those two examples of change that I described before, that were seen as unimaginable even a few years before it, but still happened because lots of people argued for them and saw that they were needed. And on Monday morning, we could ditch the deficit myth and start to enable a proper spending of money in this country, akin to or even more than we're seeing in the US at the moment. We could have legislation that would enable local people to have more control over their energy and other key services, so that they were able to bring to bear their opinions about how those changes need to occur and how they should be done in a fair way. And the list goes on, but they're not being done at the moment because they're impossible or because they just cannot be won and we don't have time to talk about them. They're being done because of distributions of power that mean that certain people aren't pushing strategies that are absolutely the ones that we should be pursuing at the moment. So I would urge people to look at the book as not something that's about overthrowing capitalism, something that's more about expanding our imaginations to evolve our economic system.
Thank you, Laurie. I think I interpreted that question just because I feel that there's something that you said in the book that really hit me, which is about call it socialism, don't call it socialism. Like, it doesn't matter what it's called. These are the necessary changes I think that we need to make. And actually, this debate exists in the political class. It exists actually outside of my understanding of the things that we need to do. This is about common sense. This is about necessary, not radical. It's not about whether we're overthrowing capitalism or not. It's about the juncture we're at and the changes that we need to make. So thank you for engaging in that response. But at least for me as a reader, it felt like such a side conversation, one that we need to completely move past. And I think most people will hopefully engage in this from a place of realism. Like, where are we at and what really needs to be done? And are we going to take everything necessary? Are we going to do everything necessary to meet this moment? Unless, Matt, you want to come back on that, I'm going to ask another question.
Well, just one point would be that, I do completely take the point, but at the same time, let's take the last 10 years that we've lived in. What we have seen is the extraordinary, and this actually in some ways goes to Chris's point, we've seen the extraordinary mobilization and reorganization of our futures through planned conscious intervention of monetary and fiscal authorities. So in the aftermath of the financial crisis, this extraordinary wave of QE, monetary interventions. And of course, we've seen the same thing during COVID, where you've seen huge expansion of public debt, completely sustainable because of the backstopping by monetary authorities. So Bank of England, the Fed have bought bonds that the government have issued and sort of translated that into resources for people in the real economy. And those two examples do suggest that, we do have the power and the institutional capacity to really reconfigure and set ourselves on different directions. These, the financial system was mobilized twice to make world-making interventions in how standards of living were organized, how we live. And so we can actually, there are institutions that we can better organize. And I think then that goes to sort of what do you do on Monday? Well, let's take the Bank of England's corporate bond holdings. So some of the assets they've purchased. Those average holdings, which reflect wider financial markets, are equivalent to us hitting 3.5 degrees roughly by the end of this century, which JP Morgan's own financial notes said are sort of conditions which would make life uninhabitable for many parts of the world, for many people. What we could do on Monday is work with people like Positive Money and campaigners to say, hey, that's not good enough. You need to shift your, what the Bank of England does in terms of buying its assets in doing so, you have very systemic power. You have levers to change that. You can organize in your workplace to say, hey, what is our plan in our workplace to decarbonize? You could work with your local authority. There's a whole host of things. And, they accumulate into quite different outcomes. So, whether it's, as you said, whether it's socialism, whether it's capitalism, whatever you want to call it, the key point is you can accumulate a set of actions on Monday, which by Friday, metaphorically, by the end of the decade, can add up to quite a different or radically different institutional trajectory to the present. And that's what we need to do. So, we do have the tools there, and it's as you say, as Laura says, it's not about sort of getting lost and sort of overthrowing this or that. It's about that actually we already have seen radical engineering of our economies in the recent sort of years, and it's about making sure that engineering goes towards democracy and justice, which goes to Chris's point very briefly, which is like the state is not a static object, but it's something that you can contest and shape. And so, shouldn't be naive about its sort of, bureaucratic and centralizing problematics, but at the same time, you can contest and democratize it. And that's what we've got to do, and use its re-engineering power to set us on a different trajectory.
Thank you both. And lots of questions coming in, but really their comments very supportive of your answers. One question from Peter Lipman. I was intrigued by your use of framing of post-carbon communal luxury, as was I. Is that a deliberate rejection of sufficiency framing used by some in painting a picture of how we might respond to the challenges that we face? Who would like to jump in?
Go for?
Sorry, my internet just slightly dropped there, so so that's why I was like looking blank.
How about you get started, Laurie, and I will post the question for you.
The main point there is that we think that there are ways in which we can talk about less environmental impact, or there's a necessity to talk about less environmentally impactful lifestyles in a way that does underline the fact that they are very plentiful. Now, that's not to say that the frame that Peter's talking about there doesn't do that, but I think that particularly in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, we've many of us who've had the opportunity to lead different lifestyles in a potentially more positive way can see the things that really the many fundamental things that benefit us above and beyond, say, a certain focus on material consumption. So, for example, and none of this is new, but at the moment, we've got cities and urban areas that have developed in a way and weren't necessarily planned in a certain way, such that we've got large levels of congestion. We don't have access to certain food opportunities, nutrition opportunities that are best for us. It can be difficult for people to get around to get to the jobs they need, and the transport methods are raising air pollution. And a kind of a post-carbon plenty there would be a way that doesn't just mean that we swap, say, we take one element of that and just swap all the vehicles out for electric alternatives and say, well, there we are, we've done it. It actually connects together all the co-benefits, as it were, of how we do the replanning of that city to make sure that the housing options aren't just putting insulation in, but also that those houses are built in a way that have certain opportunities for play and certain shops that provide certain food options, for example, and themselves are owned more by local communities, which means that we're dragging in all of these connections to the other problems that we face in society. And what we're doing by talking about a post-carbon plenty really is just trying to reframe how that can be a very abundant world to try and push back against the accusations that just means some kind of carbon austerity, and also can connect in a lot of the other struggles that we see across our economic system that exist in, across the examples that I've described there. It's hard in the short amount of time that we've got here on this webinar. There are a lot of practical suggestions in the book, and I will also post into the chat now some of the things we're doing, particularly, and I really appreciate this as a prompt by people, often we're saying here we is in government. We're at a webinar at the Institute for Public Policy Research, and we are ourselves policy researchers. So a lot of what we talk about in the book, when we say we're talking about policy. But it's a really good prompt to say, well, what about us as individuals? And I'll post some notes in here in a moment, including to an article we've written about what you as an individual can do to play a role collectively with other people.
Yeah, and Peter is, if it is the Peter Littman who runs this Transition Town Networks, is obviously engaged in some ways in that sort of building of communal luxury and new ways of thriving, new forms of entrepreneurship. So you could probably better answer it better than I, Peter. But in some ways, as Laurie says, it's going back to what I said at the beginning about what do we take as natural, and whether it's about how we distribute security, how we distribute income, how we organize consumption, how we organize sort of the provision of like the basic goods and services we need to thrive, all of us to thrive and live good lives. And it's about, communal luxury is about saying, obviously in some areas, private consumption might be best, but very often private consumption relative to communal consumption, just think of 10 cars on the road relative to one bus, is much more intensive. And actually, communal forms of provision, whether it's parks, leisure centres, transport systems that Laurie was elaborating there, these are both just both like lower carbon footprints, but also open up forms of conviviality, of sort of sociality, of play, of sort of experimentation in a way that's just sort of much more bountiful, enjoyable way of living, way of communing, way of sort of being together with people. So I think what we're saying is in some ways, that might be sort of less like consumption relative to the the metrics of today, but actually would be much more luxurious, a much sort of better quality of life, even if it's not in a narrow, like, well, how much have I consumed, how many sort of private car trips have I taken today? And so it's about that sort of beginning to sort of reconceptualize how we sort of organize some of the foundational institutions. And again, you can prefigure, so this isn't about, well, if we win state power in 10 years, we can do this. It's about saying, well, actually, in transition towns, in local cooperatives, in green community wealth building initiatives, in green businesses that are trying to sort of solve real social needs and environmental problems, we can begin to build out the infrastructure and institutions of this sort of post-carbon sort of communal luxury that the question asked.
Thanks both. Okay, so I'm bringing two questions together, and this is about the international. So Flora has asked, I wondered if Matthew and Laurie could speak to how we strategically approach new internationalism you outline early in the book, international negotiations, north-south financial transfers, and the acknowledgement of historical carbon debts. And this is linked to another question, which was asking about what are the international institutions that we could be targeting for change, and if they don't exist, what would institutions fit for purpose for the type of change that we're pushing for look like? So some people have written about a Marshall Plan, a new sort of coming together and multilateralism between governments that isn't held in all of these sort of disparate UN processes that aren't really fit for purpose for the type of breakdown that we're talking about.
So it's hugely difficult at the moment. I think that we've got ourselves in a situation where there's too much of a disconnect between all the different particular elements of the environmental challenge itself. I don't think that at the moment there needs to be more of a cross-cutting conversation than just, we've got this UN climate conference on the climate targets, we've got another UN climate conference that's now going to be around a similar time on biodiversity targets, and there needs to be much more interconnection between them. And personally, I don't necessarily know how you do that at the UN level, whether or not we do have that kind of interplay that exists across those two types of the conferences that we have. I think that the existing institutions, the multilateral institutions that have a large say over a lot of the economic policies that are being rolled out internationally, need to have not just a greater balance of their policies to recognize environmental factors, and there are a number of ways that could be achieved, but also more of a say for those countries who are in our particularly vulnerable situation right now, to make sure they've got more proportionate voting rights that respect their particularly vulnerable position within the context of the global economy and the transition that needs to happen. I think that the UN Security Council, which I can see that have been mentioned on the chat here, there is a potential role for that body to play. Lots of people at the moment in this climate security world, a world in which you've got experts on security challenges who are starting to talk more about at least the climate crisis and the wider environmental crisis. They talk about how adopting certain frames and effort at the UN Security Council level can be really useful because it has much more sway over particularly apparatus of the UN. And so if it was adopting this as a security priority, it could be something that exercises the power and priorities of, say, the UN system in a much more systematic way. I think that is a really interesting proposition. At the same time, we've got to make sure that the security frame there doesn't play too much on, say, a more militaristic or traditional security frame, and that it includes all the elements that, you know, security experts do talk about as well, but need to be at the forefront of our minds, like human rights issues, like issues around migration, and like issues around economic equity and power imbalances as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty good answer. And given we're pressed for time, should we take another answer on?
Yes. Okay.
Question. Even?
So, question from Jason Spinney. Some might argue there is a firm control of the narrative in the media, and there's a bunch of questions that are kind of like this around this issue and other linked issues, social justice, for example. With this in mind, how do we change this message delivery system and get this conversation out of this lovely but closed shop and out to the masses so that the majority can push this with governments and generate change?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And as ever, I think when you do sort of a balance sheet of the positives and the negatives, actually, like if you look around, you know, early this year, I don't know if people noticed, but the Sun and the Daily Express and potentially even the Daily Mail did a sort of like, we're going green, and they sort of like, you know, turn their front pages green, and they sort of were making a big like hoopla around like, you know, decarbonisation as global Britain's role. Now, whether that's, you know, skin deep, you know, in some ways that's a separate question. What is interesting is that actually, you know, many of the sort of, you know, even 5 years ago, certainly 10, 15 years ago, sort of climate denialist style media institutions are now sort of, you know, in quite a different space. And that's thanks to sort of social pressure. It's just thanks to sort of the work of activists, of scientists, of institutions like IPPR, sort of putting out the message, just hammering away. So I think there is change there, but I think, I think it's, you know, probably right to be a little skeptical about how sort of, you know, on the side of transformation those institutions are. So I think it's about continuing to build up and support alternative forms of media and sort of investigative journalism and all the rest. And then I think it's about sort of, and again, we've seen this during COVID, and it's been quite interesting to watch the BBC's macroeconomic analysis around public borrowing, about public debt relative to the post-2008 financial crisis, where there's been a much more nuanced argument in recent months. Journalists like Andy Verity, who's an economics editor there. And what that shows is actually we do have institutions and medias that can sort of, you know, speak to big communities and that are subject to engagement, to steady, you know, sort of communicating from activists, movements, academics, practitioners about new forms of evidence. And I think, you know, you really can, you know, if you look at our media landscape today, it's obviously not perfect, you know, in terms of the concentration of ownership and power, that's absolutely true. But certainly in terms, if you look at some of the voices that are on there, you know, if you look at something like the Neon Network, there's an organization that provides a fantastic range of practitioners and sort of people on the front line of many of these issues. And so I think I completely agree that the media is sort of, in some ways, fundamentally an institution that we need to think about, you know, whether it's the BBC, whether it's sort of print journalism, etc. But I think that there are, you know, areas of potential change, there's areas of real hope in terms of some of that sort of pluralistic sort of media reform agendas. And I think, you know, in fact, in the book, we do have a little bit of a section on how reforming the media has to go hand in hand with sort of wider strategies for institutional change, because, you know, all of these things are interconnected.
You also have a section on digital ownership, which is a big part of the news media and how we interact with news and how our data is used to really just create these echo chambers. So I think that is also really relevant. Another question, how can we positively link the ability of people to act locally? There are so many good examples with our global institutions that have us hostage on a runaway train. Are there any examples that you're aware of or models that could serve as seeds for change that could provide a vision of such positive connected change?
I think because it's dealt with in another question, the well-being frame that is being adopted by a number of governments, and actually I think Catherine Trebek, who is one of the foremost well-being economics people, is among the audience. that's taking a frame that is very much understandable at the local level. So taking a wider picture of what we basically define as the elements that we want progress in society, beyond, say, just a headline focus on maximizing GDP. So that includes access to certain political opportunities, being able to exercise your voice. It includes a basket of basic things that you need, like enough nutrition and other bits and bobs like that. And then it tries to take that idea of what the objectives are and then apply it more, both in ensuring that they're the major motivators of economic policy at a local level. So that instead of local authorities thinking, well, we've got to just make all these decisions because our ultimate metric is GDP. And it's a bit more complicated than that, but often many of the development outcomes that we've seen in the UK have sometimes been pushed by that lodestar. Whereas if we take a much wider picture of what we define as the objectives of society, a more of a holistic well-being approach, that then gets local authorities, say, to do all sorts of interesting things and potentially involve citizens in doing so as well. That can be neatly, or it's beginning to be thought about how it can be neatly be scaled substantively more towards the national level in a way that could really make difference. And one example that's often talked about is the example of the well-being budget in New Zealand, where a certain amount of the government budgetary spend over the course of a period has been specifically designated to be spent using those kind of metrics. And I think that that's a really interesting example of something that in some ways is very much rooted in the local level, but has potentially big implications internationally, because it is inspirational for other countries to see this. There's a proof of concept that could be spread elsewhere. And crucially, some of those ideas themselves have come through international organizations, or they've acted as a kind of transmission mechanism. And the OECD in particular, the sort of the wealthier nations, as it were, think tank, which is often how it's characterized in the media, was a bit of a place, a sort of convener when it came to some of those ideas, as well as now the fantastic groups like the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and their WeGo operation, which are spreading those things internationally. So there's this sort of filtering effect that we're already starting to see that's spreading internationally, which again, it sounds, it requires a bit of imagination to understand how that could spread more, but that's already happening. And that's something that's happened in a very short amount of time and could easily scale much faster and much quicker.
Fabulous. Alrighty, we're going to move to closing remarks. I have one last question, which is, how do you want people to use this book? And what is the underlying message? And maybe you can close out your remarks with that. Is what is the underlying message you want people to take away from it? I mean, I can summarize it as much as I like, and people can take and ask questions that, latch onto one piece of what you're trying to tell us. But what is the underlying message that you'd like people to take away? And what do you want people to do with this book? I've already told you this is going to be a reference book for me, and I've already thought of 3 other people that I want to send this book to help guide their work. But what is your vision for this book?
So I'll go first, Matt, if you want. I primarily as a bit of a guide, hopefully, to some of the big issues that we need to grapple with here. One of the main ones being that there are a number of difficulties with the mainstream frame, the one that we often get through the media or the way that politicians talk. And that's primarily the frame that we're looking through here, that we don't talk enough about how this is a wider environmental crisis. We don't talk enough about how that is a result of our systems. And within that, power is a really key determinant of what is happening now and the kind of change that we can have. And those, I think, are just really important things to conceive of. And it's good today to have got the sort of prompt that when you talk about those issues, it may sound like you're talking about this sort of knee-jerk reaction of overthrowing this, or, this sort of utopian vision of just getting rid of a certain economic system. But I think that what we're trying to do is contribute, as many others already are, in trying to understand how those issues are actually far more at the forefront than our mainstream frame sometimes allows us to think or itself accepts. And then the rest of the book is supposed to be a bit of a guide for navigating some of the movements and the ideas that have been around now for a number of years and for many years before that. And at least for me personally, this may be completely different for the rest of you on this call. back when I started at, say, IPPR, and I started working at the end of 2015, I found it really difficult that as I went around having discussions with people in policymaking, again, that's one of the main frames that we're looking at with this book, though not exclusively. I found it really difficult that people weren't really talking not just about the climate crisis, but about this full picture of the crisis. And then I go away and see scientists who had been, acutely worried about this for a very long time. I was then frustrated that they weren't also talking about elements of power, and that they weren't also talking about how there's already a huge amount of stuff that's already being done, and that in many respects, we just need to be scaling many of those things. And what the book is trying to do is almost, literally didn't do it because of this, but provide a bit of a guidebook to that kind of lost soul that I just described there, that I was way back then. And one of the amazing things that we have, I hope, all discovered in very different ways is that since that time, since say 2016, a lot of those people who've been thinking similarly, who've had similar frustrations and have got a lot of these ideas, have burst out more and more onto the mainstream. And that's been amazing to see. In some ways, it's already been also been frightening, because it sort of confirms one's fears about how some of the mainstream frames aren't really dealing with this properly. And the book is also supposed to be a bit of a guidebook. And we were really almost glad by the opportunity that the book in the end got delayed by COVID, that we were able to include so many more of those things that seem to be popping up every month. So yeah, use it as a bit of a guidebook. Hope you do find it useful. And if there are elements of it that you don't think are quite right, one of the ones I'm taking from tonight is that sometimes the frame about power can be seen as a kind of construed as a knee-jerk reaction of wanting to overthrow the economic system wholesale, then please do get in touch, because we do want to have a conversation here. And it's so important for activists and others who are in this space to get more of that feedback, because as we all know, this needs to be done very quickly. And at the end of the day, we're experimenting with loads of different approaches to see what works.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for the questions and for being here. It's been a pleasure. I think, and it's a great final question there. I mean, I think in some ways, overall, Bubble was being a sort of resource of hope. And so there's that Seamus Heaney quote, "Hope is not optimism, which expects things to turn out well, but something rooted in the conviction that there is good worth working for." And so, from that, I think, this book is trying to say, look, let's really face up to the scale of the challenge, but that shouldn't create doom and dismobilizing sort of sense of, well, we can't do anything. We need to understand how we got here. We need to sort of work out what are the mechanics and drives of it, because that's how we address it. And then we need to recognize that we've never had greater capacity as a species, as a sort of, collectivity, to build a better world out from where we are today. And there is extraordinary good worth fighting for. And that not only is it worth fighting for, but we can win that fight and build a better world if we have this sort of imagination, hope, and sort of collective ambition. And so I think hopefully it'll just be a sort of, one of many contributions. And I think that's, one of the great moments. There are so many sort of roots that are sort of springing into life now of hopeful action and hopeful activity, sort of struggling for that new world. And hopefully it's about, a contribution, about that cumulative effort to build a better world.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And Laurie, you are not the only lost soul. I imagine that there's many people out there who similarly feel, whether they have the intimate understanding of the crisis like you do or not, that we're just not we're not getting the full story, and the solutions that we're talking about are really not, are tinkering around the edges and are not really meeting the scale and urgency of the challenges that we face. And I think you're right, Matt. This isn't sickly sweet hopefulness that comes out of this book. It's a sobering hopefulness. It's one that's rooted in reality. It's one that's rooted in things that are already happening in the world, that recognizes that we both have the tools and the imagination and the cooperation already existing in our societies that will be a foundation for the type of transformation that we need over the next decade. So the challenge to everyone out there is to really go and read this book, to go share it with everyone, because one of the challenges I think that we face is our own ability to imagine things being different. That is really the primary challenge that we face, is that it's just difficult because of power, because of how our economic system has really created a culture right from, our universities being challenged as places where we can have active debate around this stuff. And the curriculum, it wasn't that long ago that Michael Gove was trying to rip climate change out of the curriculum. That is not by coincidence. That's because we have a system that's trying to really stop us from asking the hard questions and imagining fundamentally that there is another way of doing things, that there is another way of living together, both in harmony and a way that is rooted in justice, that most people everywhere will live better lives as a result of this transformation. We aren't trying to, create a future where most people lose out. Most people are losing out today. So on that note, thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you'll interact with the book, engage with Laurie and Matthew and IPPR on Twitter. And there's lots of great writing out there that goes into even more depth through Matt's Commonwealth project and organization that you should also check out. Have a good evening and hopefully see you on one of these webinars again, or in real person. Hopefully coming out of this pandemic, we'll be able to have an in-person meeting soon.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Fatima. And
Thanks
thanks,
everyone.
IPPR.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.